Welcome to the Navy Memorial's first SITREP, and thank you very much for joining us. This event focuses on that fourth verb in our mission, inform. We named this speaker series after the traditional Navy Situation Report, or SITREP, which are communications routinely transmitted by commanding officers to inform their boss about a current situation. They're designed to provide a clear, concise synopsis of the situation, focusing on meaning and context in addition to the facts. And today, we have two guests here to do just that. And we're doing it on a topic that is on everyone's mind, the Navy and COVID-19. First, I would like to introduce our Surgeon General, Admiral Bruce Gillingham. He's an orthopedic surgeon and an undersea and diving medical officer. He served around the world, including serving on the hospital ship Mercy and deployed in Iraq with the Marines. He's commanded Naval Medical Center San Diego and Naval Hospital Jacksonville, Florida. He's been the fleet surgeon for both the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet. And of note, Admiral Gillingham was the senior medical officer, the senior Navy medical officer in the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Also joining us today is Admiral K.T. Thomas. Unfortunately, early this afternoon, Admiral Phil Sawyer let us know that he'd been called away to a senior level meeting. He apologized, and we all understand, if we've worked in the Pentagon, what it's like. And he did assure us that it's not a crisis. It's just one of those Pentagon situations where when you get called to a senior level meeting, you don't really have a choice. So I'd like to introduce his deputy, Admiral K.T. Thomas. Admiral Thomas is the Assistant Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations Plans and Strategy. He's deployed numerous times flying E-2C Hawkeyes. He's commanded VAW 117 during Iraqi freedom, and he's commanded the USS Mount Whitney and the aircraft carriers Abe Lincoln and Carl Vinson, as well as the Ronald Reagan Battle Group. Ashore, and most notably ashore, he served as the director of the very important 21st Century Sailor Office. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce first Admiral K.T. Thomas. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Admiral Thorpe and Navy Memorial for giving us this opportunity today to come out and talk to folks about what the Navy's doing to adapt to operations in the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly there's a lot of uncertainty caused by operating with COVID-19, but it makes protecting the stability and the security of our sea even that much more important. Clearly there's been global trade interruption and the supply chains are stressed. And if there's more economic disruption, it could lead to some further problems for some of the more vulnerable regions around the world. So that's why it's important that our Navy, your Navy, is operating forward like we normally do. Navy has nearly 300 ships, as everybody's aware, and I'm pretty proud to report that more than 90 of those ships are deployed right now, and they're COVID-free. We want to keep it that way. Those ships, those aircraft, those submarines are sailing in every fleet, and they're manned by sailors. And the health of those sailors is incredibly important. The sailors are providing the security and stability not only of the sea lanes, but also for our allies and partners around the world. We currently have assets in every corner of the world. In the Pacific Fleet, it's been in the news recently that we just conducted a couple of freedom of navigation operations, Taiwan Strait Transit. In the Middle East, Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Bataan ARG are out there protecting that part of the world. Up in the high north, we just finished an exercise up above Arctic Circle with a Surface Action Group, conducting an anti-submarine warfare exercise with our closest ally, United Kingdom. Closer to home, we've got the Nimitz Strike Group off the west coast, conducting their Comp 2X. It's the final certification exercise before they deploy. On the east coast, we've got the Harry S. Truman that has been off the coast as a surge carrier, ready to respond to any need around the world. There's others. There's the Abe Lincoln out off the west coast of San Diego and the Gerald R. Ford. And if you've been counting, that's 6 aircraft carriers at sea. It's a large presence, and they're all training and operating, and they're all COVID-free. On top of that, we have our shipyards. We have our fleet readiness centers that are maintaining our aircraft and our ships and building our future fleet. And all of these units and entities are doing it with mitigation measures that we put in place so we can continue to operate as best as we can in a normal environment. We've learned and we've adapted a lot over the recent months. We've changed how we operate, but it hadn't stopped us from operating, and that's the most important detail. An example of some of the things that we've learned, I think everybody was very sensitive to the term force protection. It's part of our everyday business. What I would tell you we learned is a lot about health protection conditions. I will admit that I didn't know a whole lot about that, but I've learned an awful lot the last few months, and it's going to be probably part of our lexicon for the coming years. We're all engaged in learning about the virus. My boss skipped out on this event because he's with the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, conducting a meeting on this very topic and how we're going to conduct operations and how we're going to conduct testing as we expand testing throughout our force. We not only are learning within the United States Navy and sharing up and down and across our fleets, we're also engaging our allies and our partners and sharing the lessons that we've learned. One of the greatest examples of that is the Naval Sea Systems Command Chief Engineer, when we had the TR incident, quickly established a team that went not only up and down Navy channels, but out to corporate America to figure out how do you clean, industrial clean, a ship like the Theodore Roosevelt. And then we shared that information with our allies and partners so that they could learn our lessons and keep their fleets operating and COVID-free. There's still a lot to learn, and we're learning every day. We apply the lessons from the outbreaks on the Theodore Roosevelt and the Kidd. Outbreaks at sea, we learned very quickly that the best thing to do is to ensure that we send our ships to sea with the best chance of being COVID-free as possible. We've established frameworks to talk about prevention, to talk about mitigation on how we can minimize the chance of getting COVID on board our ships. We've established guidance for the fleets where they restrict movement of sailors for 14 days before they go to sea, and then we test folks before they enter the ship, or if they're on the ship, we test them to ensure we can root out the asymptomatic carriers that could cause infection across our crew. We're doing everything we can possibly do to ensure the health of our sailors and to ensure that our Navy can continue to operate forward so we can protect the global commons. Before I take questions, I'd like to certainly turn it over to Admiral Gillingham for a few remarks.
Well, thank you, Admiral Thomas. And I also appreciate Admiral Thorpe and the Navy Memorial's opportunity to provide an overview of Navy medicine's role in the response to COVID-19. One of the great things has been the close synergistic relationship that we've had with our line colleagues, providing our Navy medicine knowledge with operational expertise. I think has really led to the significant advances that we've been able to make to protect the fleet. Now, I'll confess that as an orthopedic surgeon, I tend to think of the projection of medical power in support of maritime superiority as combat casualty care, for example. But in this case, as Admiral Thomas mentioned, truly is our experts in public health, preventive medicine, and research, and our research scientists who are playing a key role in force health protection. We've learned a significant amount about this very stealthy adversary, and we've applied it not only to the restoration and recovery of the TR, the Kidd, and the fleet and the Marine Corps in general, but in a larger sense, we'll be sharing all that we learned with the nation. One of the key features is the application of what I like to think of as rapid cycle feedback, a development of guidance, application to the fleet after review by our operational colleagues, and then rapid feedback as to whether or not there are any gaps resulting from that guidance. And as a result, we've been able to refine what we've been able to tell the fleet and the Marine Corps about staying safe. This stems from investment, frankly, and hard work by our Navy Marine Corps Public Health Center, our Naval Medical Research Center, working through their operational units, the Navy Medical Research Units, which are located throughout the world, and our Navy Environmental Preventive Medicine Units, along with our fleet surgeons, our independent duty corpsmen, who are our medical representatives on our smaller ships, but all functioning as one Navy medicine. Just as an example, some of the lessons learned about the atypical presentation of coronavirus that we learned from the TR actually informed able to provide to the fleet, and the independent duty corpsmen aboard the Kidd recognized early that he had an atypical presentation as his first case, and he was able to instantly know that he needed to get assistance. He isolated those who were suspected of being infected, and I think that led to the very good outcome that has resulted. We also learned the importance of once a certain number of the crew are involved, that made better sense to bring that crew to a port, rapidly quarantine those who were exposed, isolate those who had tested positive, and as a result, we're developing a rapid response team, a public health rapid response team that will include not only experts in critical care, just in case, but also testing experts who can go aboard our smaller ships that do not have inherent testing capability to provide that and to immediately respond. I'd also like to mention that Navy medicine has been heavily involved in the DSCA, that is the Defense Support to Civilian Authority response. And we've learned a lot there, and adaptability and flexibility has really been our hallmark. Our hospital ships, I think everyone knows, are designed to support combat casualty care. But in New York, the crew was able to adapt rapidly, recognizing that there was a real need for them to use their intensive care unit capability to unload some of the stressed hospitals in New York City. And so they were able to convert their ICUs into isolation wards and care for a number of very ill COVID patients. Fortunately for USNS Mercy, Los Angeles did not require that level of support, and so we were able to have some of our crew actually go ashore and help medical staffs at skilled nursing facilities in the state of California. Our expeditionary medical facilities, which are our Role 3, our combat capability field hospitals, when we recognized that there was a need for those medical personnel to support the response inside the United States, we knew that we needed to change the composition of those teams, that those teams, like the Mercy and Comfort, are designed for surgical missions. We stripped out most of the surgical capability, emphasized our medical response, our intensive care unit doctors, pulmonologists, critical care nurses, put them into smaller teams, and they actually dispersed throughout the United States to several sites, and were able to work side by side, shoulder to shoulder with civilian colleagues for the care of COVID patients. This has important implications. So we were already rethinking the design of the expeditionary medical facility. So we see this as important lessons learned that we can apply to increased modularity of those capabilities going forward. Winning this war on this virus is going to continue to be an all hands on deck evolution. And we know because of the unique nature of this virus, the possibility of asymptomatic transmission, that we cannot completely eliminate the presence. We will continue to do all that we can with restriction of movement before deployment, testing, et cetera, to minimize the presence of the virus. But frankly, what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions are going to be the key to success. And that is strict hand washing, mask wear, physical isolation where possible to the maximum extent possible, and personal responsibility. And our sailors understand that and are demonstrating that. We were able to get Nimitz underway using those protocols, and we will continue to do all that we can to make sure that our Navy is operating forward in defense of our nation. So thank you.
Thanks, Admiral Gillingham, and thank you, Admiral Thomas. And thank you also for agreeing to take some questions. As you can see, watching this, there's a button on the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. And if there's a question you find particularly interesting on this topic, please give it a vote. And on that note, I'd ask you to keep your question relevant to today's discussion, the Navy and COVID-19, and then we'll take the questions that are the most interesting and the most pertinent to that topic. So let me start off actually with a question for Admiral Thomas, kind of a big picture question. We're about 9 weeks into this now, and we're learning about this virus more every day and sometimes by the hour. We know so much more now than we did 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks ago, when you were making some pretty big decisions and you were advising the CNO and the national security team. So looking back, can you give us kind of an inside look at, as you adapted, how did you adapt and how did you move forward setting up the policies for the Navy to deal with COVID? And can you walk through, just kind of give us an understanding of how the Navy is adapting to the pandemic? And did you ever just say, hey, why don't we tie the ships up to the pier for a while?
All right, sir, I'll take the last part easy first. I think that's the easiest. Certainly the Navy's not going to take a knee. We're not going to pull our ships in, tie up to the pier and walk away. So it's not what we do. And what we did is we do what the Navy does best, and that is we jumped all in. We created crisis management teams. We created phone calls among not only our senior leaders in the Pentagon, but we had twice-a-day phone calls where we brought in the fleets on the phone call in the afternoon so that we could make sure we stayed aligned with what they were seeing in the out forward with what we were trying to establish. We had teams within the Pentagon and senior leadership of OSD and joint staff that were tied into the White House task force that we're learning daily. And then obviously I got to learn Bruce's deputy very well, Gail Schaefer. She and I talk on a daily basis and come up with bounce ideas. I'm certainly not the medical professional, and she's a dentist, and so the two of us have had an interesting time learning a lot about this virus and consulting the experts. And then what we did is we started out thinking about it in some kind of blocking and tackling perspectives. We said, okay, what can we do to prevent, and what are these great public health mitigation measures? And we went where everybody else is going primarily, and that's the CDC is the authoritative source. Got the public health mitigation measures in place, whether it was people coming to work at shore, operating on a ship at sea, or operating on a ship in port. And then we said, okay, now what kind of prevention can we put in place, and created a prevention framework and a mitigation framework to mitigate the chance of getting COVID on board. And then we said, well, we're probably going to get a ship that gets a large outbreak. So how can we recover that ship? And that's what I talked about earlier, going to NAVC and figuring out how can we clean the ship. And now, truthfully, we're at the point of looking at this being an enduring operating mechanism, and we're creating a warfighting readiness lines of effort to keep being able to operate the way we know we're going to need to in this existing environment. So it's been a learning process along the way. It's been sharing from what we call Echelon 1, the Pentagon, guidance, broad guidance in these frameworks, then allowing the fleets to hang in the actual guidance that they need based on their local or their particular condition, and then getting feedback to ensure that we continue to update it as we learn throughout. So it's been a rapid pace this last few months. I'm pretty proud, like I said, to say that we have 90 ships at sea. They're COVID-free. Bruce mentioned that it's the sailor. It's the sailor understanding these measures that we put in place. I really do believe it's about culture. It's about ensuring that everybody knows that if they're not feeling well, that they don't come in. They raise their hand and say, hey, I need to take a knee, maybe not our Navy, but individually, such that we can not infect the team, because the team has to be able to fight and to continue to operate.
Thank you. Admiral Gillingham, question from your perspective. You've spent a career coordinating with specific medical experts and the fleet. Epidemiologists are now a big part of your life. Can you take us inside the way that this coordination has gone with the medical experts and with the fleet, and how that's impacted your response and the Navy's response to COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Edward Thorpe. I'd be happy to. I think the key is deferring to expertise, and so knowing where the knowledge is. We're fortunate. We have a DoD liaison to the CDC. He's a Navy commander, a preventive medicine physician, and so we've been working closely with him. We've been working closely across the interagency and the other services to fundamentally understand the virus to the maximum extent possible. And as we have gained knowledge from our scientists, from our public health experts, we've then developed guidance. And as I said in the beginning, We prepare what we think is the best medical advice, but we understand that that has to be applied in an operational environment. And so using our line colleagues to understand and get feedback from them, our medical representatives out forward, our independent duty corpsmen who are both with the Navy and, of course, with the Marines, our fleet surgeons, to have them give us feedback. We have, just as Admiral Thomas mentioned, we've had repeated series of ongoing phone calls to work out, to propose strategy for force health protection, but then to adjust that literally daily if necessary as we get feedback from the field. And I will tell you that as medical professionals, we're used to following the evidence. And I would say that's really the key here, is that we're following the medical evidence and adjusting our guidance as we go.
Great, thanks. And kind of continuing along that line, and then I'll go to a question from our audience. Admiral Thomas, the CNO has stated pre-COVID that he wants today's Navy to be the most lethal force in our history. I think that's an exact quote, and was kind of part of his guiding principles as he came on. And as you navigated through this pandemic, CNO put out some pretty clear guidance on keeping the force safe. Just in the last week, though, in addition to all the COVID discussion, there have been stories in the press, and you mentioned it, 6 carriers at sea. We've got Navy operations in the Barents Sea, in the Arctic, and most notably the Arabian Gulf and the Western Pacific. It seems almost like there's 2 stories going on here. Navy operations and forward presence, just like pre-COVID, and managing inside a pandemic and following the CNO's guidance for keeping the force safe. How are you balancing those 2?
I think it really
We've learned a lot. We've figured out how
learned a
to
lot.
establish guidance to ensure that before the sailor steps on board that ship to go to sea, that they have the best chance of being COVID-free so they can continue to operate. And then we're out at sea. We talked about it. The ships are forward. The ships are where they need to be. We're looking at schedules. We're looking at having to build extra time into some schedules to be able to provide for the ROM, the restriction of movement, before we get to sea. And then we're looking at how that might be impacting our shipyard forces to make sure that we can get the maintenance accomplished that needs to be done to keep our ships going where they are. But it really is from a lethality perspective, our Navy still has got the strongest, most present Navy out there forward. And then we have sailors that understand the mission, and we have sailors that we're keeping healthy, and they're part of the solution, as like I mentioned, coming forward if they're not feeling well. And then we've talked a lot about how do we operate at sea with this if we need to, and then if we have the opportunity to come closer to shore and remove sailors that need to be removed, we have that option to mitigate the impact as well. So all those things are being discussed on a routine basis. The fleets have their own guidance out there on how they're operating. And certainly depending on the scenario and the situation, we adjust and take care of the situation as it presents. But I think just like the CNO ordered, we're with 90 ships, more than 90 ships out, and 6 carrier strike groups. It's a pretty lethal force. It's at sea today.
Thanks. And following up a little bit on that, there's a question out here from the audience that talks about FONOPS. And so the freedom of navigation operations in Western Pacific, and I've been reading ships going through the Taiwan Straits and Navy presence around foreign vessels to ensure that the freedom of navigation. Can you touch on why in this time of pandemic, is the time any different than any others, and why we're continuing to do those freedom of navigation drills, operations, really?
Yeah, I'd love to.
I had the great fortune and great opportunity to be the commander of Task Force 70 for the Ronald Reagan Strike Group. So we sailed over in the South China Sea quite a bit. And it's important that we sail anywhere that international law allows, and that we challenge excessive claims to features that are well established with law. And if we don't, then we kind of cede that authority, that statement to somebody else to make the rules if we don't enforce international law. And certainly during this time, with many nations, not just our own nation, but other nations that maybe don't have quite the resources or the size of Navy to be able to get out to sea with as many ships as they normally would, it's even that much more important for the U.S. Navy to step forward and support our allies and partners. And that part of the world in particular is where a great amount of the trade flows. And with these disrupted supply chains, with these disrupted global economic situations, there's opportunity for others that may want to take advantage of that to do things that maybe we wouldn't agree with. So that's, I would say, now more than ever, it's important to have a ready Navy forward sailing where it matters.
Thanks. Question for both of you, and maybe Admiral Thomas off, and then maybe Admiral Gillingham from the medical side. So the carrier Theodore Roosevelt's been in the news. We've got a question here about it. And I know neither of you are in a position to talk about the commanding officer himself or the specific situation. But the situation as we know it, and struck with a lot of disease and a couple other ships, I think what really would be interesting is shed some light on what we've learned from that and how has that affected the guidance that you all are putting out? How's it affected the testing process you're doing across the fleet and whatever you could say about the Theodore Roosevelt, but more importantly from a fleet perspective. Admiral Thomas, over to you, please.
I'd say from a fleet perspective, the thing I learned the most is it's really insidious virus that can, with this asymptomatic aspect of folks that can walk around a crew and can unknowingly infect their shipmates. It's more important than ever that we ensure that we deploy and then we
call them bubbles. I'll just describe that briefly. We like to talk about bubble operations where we create as best a bubble that we can that's free of COVID, whether that's waiting 14 days in a sequester, restriction of movement manner, not interacting with others so that we know that if somebody has the virus, it will have run its course. And we're using numbers, not only CDC numbers, but then Bruce and his team have added a couple of days of margin in some of these cases. So 14 days it exceeds CDC guidance, and I'll let Bruce get into the details there. But we create this bubble, whether it's at our recruit training commands, whether it's on our ships, and then we make really darn sure that we don't penetrate that bubble. And an example, we do carrier onboard delivery ops to maintain our ships while we're at sea. Well, we learned from TR that we got to be very careful how we interact. We don't know that that's how TRs, we really don't know what started that situation on the TR, but one of the threat vectors would be a carrier onboard delivery aircraft coming aboard with what we call prospective gains, people that would join the crew during a deployment. Well, we are now not doing that with some of our ships, and the Harry S. Truman, who's off the East Coast, is what we would call a ship in a bubble right now. We know they're clean. They've been at sea long enough that they don't have COVID-19, and we're not going to do anything that might penetrate that bubble, like have people come aboard, or if they do have to come aboard, we're going to make sure that they've conducted their own restriction of movement, and we're going to test them to make sure that they're as COVID-free as possible before we allow somebody to get aboard the ship. So we've changed our operational mindset a little bit in that regard, and then we've also learned a lot from a testing perspective, and I'll let Bruce get into that when we're done.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, I would say that the virus behavior is critical, and as I mentioned earlier, as we understand that, the asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission is probably its secret power, frankly, in the sense that an individual could be shedding virus, potentially infecting others before they even know they're ill. And so part of that mitigation is to make sure that we limit the cohort to the smallest size that we can, so that if an individual unknowingly infects their shipmates, it's a much smaller group. We also, because of that, being very aggressive about contact tracing. So if an individual does present to medical, is ill, test positive for COVID, then we will do an aggressive contact trace. And we've learned a lot about what constitutes a close contact. And so those individuals go in quarantine, in parallel with the individual that was ill and that's in isolation. I will say for those that become ill, fortunately, in younger people, it appears that the impact of the virus is perhaps less than those who are older or those who have other medical conditions. But we've learned some methods to closely follow them and monitor them, and we're doing that. Again, lessons learned. But with regard to the testing, the current what is known as PCR, polymerase chain reaction testing, is very good for demonstrating the virus. It's not quite as good for telling you if you have a negative that you're truly negative. And so that led to the restriction of movement. So we know that the likelihood of an individual manifesting symptoms is about 95% of those will within 14 days. And so that, coupled with testing at the exit of restriction of movement, we believe reduces the risk even further. And then, of course, as I said earlier, recognizing that as precise as we want to be, and as much as we want to minimize the risk, we have to recognize that it's certainly possible for the virus still to get aboard ship. And so then the enhanced mitigation measures that I mentioned, small cohorts, meal times that are stretched out so that individuals aren't shoulder to shoulder while they eat, and as well close follow-up with the crew, and a very high index suspicion for anybody shows with any of the potential symptoms that represent COVID.
So I have to tell you, well, that's probably the most in-depth description I've heard of the testing, and I appreciate that. And I want to go to a question here on the screen from Carol Pottinger, who her question, I'll just read it here. You've discussed the health of the force, and I think I'll go to both of you with this again too as well. Carol Pottinger writes, how would CNO characterize? I would add also, how do you all characterize the morale? How's the morale out there? And with everything going on, and both the medical impact as well as what we're all dealing with here in the country, how's the morale of the force? And I'll flip it around and go to Admiral Gillingham first on this one. And what are you hearing through the medical community about the morale?
I think the morale is very good. We know that we're in uniform to support the fleet and the Marine Corps, and so to be put in this situation, to have the fleet depend on us like this, is our opportunity, frankly, to demonstrate our true value. We know that we have always provided force health protection. It's just significantly magnified or amplified in this situation. And so in one sense, it's an opportunity to demonstrate what we're able to do. But we know that we have a sacred trust with our brothers and sisters in uniform. And so the opportunity to be front and center and protect them, I think, is a source of tremendous pride and honor for those in Navy medicine.
Thanks. Admiral Thomas?
Probably let Bruce.
No one want to answer that question. I can tell you about the morale in the Pentagon. No, I'm just kidding. It is a tough situation in the sense that we're asking sailors to go to sea. We're asking them to sail at the front lines and not pull in port. That's one of the things. You join the Navy, you go see the world, you get a chance to go see foreign countries and experience that. And truthfully, not a lot of ships pulling in port anywhere. None. That's a hard pill to swallow. But I also have had the opportunity to lead sailors many times, and sailors are pretty resilient individuals. They understand, and commanders, we really do rely on our commanders to message this properly, to make them understand the questions that you asked earlier, why it's important right now to have a Navy at sea forward deployed. I'm pretty confident. I know an awful lot of commanders out there, and I'm pretty confident that they're explaining the importance of the mission that they're doing, and sailors are pretty smart creatures as well. They understand that what the impact that they have, and what that carrier or what that cruiser or submarine, the importance in a fragile is maybe a little strong word for the state of world affairs, but certainly it's not as solid as it was 9 weeks ago. And we've got some fractures in the economies, some fractures in relationships, and so the Navy is what provides that security and stability, and I think sailors get that. And so, I've always found that if I understood my mission, if I understood and felt what I was doing was important, that my morale was always a lot higher. But I have no doubt that the fact that we're asking them to, in Truman's case, stay on the East Coast and not pull in, or in the case of the Eisenhower that's been out CENTCOM and is not pulling into port. I know that's challenging. Sailors would very much like to be seeing the world, and heck, I know a lot of Americans would like to be traveling and seeing the United States too, and they're not. So it's a sacrifice that we're all making based on this unusual situation, and I'm pretty sure our sailors understand that.
Thanks. So let me change course here a little bit and ask a question that's popping up to the top here from Sink Harris. And again, I think this is also could go to both of you, and I'll ask Admiral Gillingham to take it first again. What does the Navy need industry and academia to do to support the Navy going forward to address operational needs in the light of COVID-19? And I kind of maybe expand that a little bit. What do they need, and what can you tell us that's happening now with the collaboration that's going on? So both the need and what's going on now, if you could address either one of those, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Great question. We need, the best minds to continue to help us to understand this virus. I think that the next paradigm shift, one in diagnostics, will be understanding what serology means. So we have ability to measure serology, but we don't know what that means in terms of immunity for the individual. And so I think that will be a major step forward in terms of being able to test an individual, understand their immune status. So I look forward to that. I think certainly many are focused on the development of vaccine, and that will be critical to the future. Getting through this and being able to return to normal operations, if you will. But in the meantime, there's very promising work. Some of it done at Naval Medical Research Center, but of course, academic medical centers and laboratories on monoclonal antibodies. That is the ability to produce large amounts of a neutralizing antibody that can go after the virus that you can actually take as a therapeutic. And so I think that's and there's promising work going on. And I think in addition, continue to produce point of care testing that will allow us to rapidly test, to facilitate that contact tracing that I said, and those that are suspected of having contacted someone who is positive. So I think there's going to be the industrial base, medical industrial base, if you will, but coupled with even more importantly the academic medical base, if you will.
Admiral Thomas, anything on the operations side of that?
Yeah, I'll address the cleaning piece, and I mentioned it a few times already that our Naval Sea Systems Command and the engineers have been working with industry to come up with industrial size cleaning. When you've got to clean an aircraft carrier, that takes unique ways of doing it. We've been exploring ultraviolet light and some of the other mechanisms. We're looking at digital contact tracing, what kind of applications can be out there to help us know who you've been in contact with for a certain amount of time to help us in the contact tracing. And I'll give a sea story. A couple examples. The USS Kidd is generally a good news story, and that we had the sailor and the independent duty corpsman identify that they had a challenge on the ship. We rapidly took an Abyss machine, one of these industry-created point-of-care testing machines, put it on a P-8 and flew it down to South America to get aboard that ship, along with some doctors out of Jacksonville, the hospital there. That was kind of the genesis of the way we have planned to approach an outbreak at sea at this point. We've now established a flyaway team that has some testing capacity so we can rapidly understand what we have. And we couldn't have done that without having that Abyss machine that has been pushed along and made available and something that's very portable. And so that's the type of things that industry has developed to help us in the Navy deal with this pandemic.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot now about testing and you mentioned the Kidd and TR came up earlier. I guess this goes to Admiral Gillingham, but Admiral Thomas, I'll leave it up to you two. But Admiral Gillingham, what is the scope of COVID-19 in the Navy? How many people? Can you give us a number of how many people have been diagnosed with COVID-19 in the Navy? And and you've touched on it, but as you deal with a number, and you've talked a little bit about it, is there anything else you want to add about measures you're taking to keep that number down? I mean, what I've seen, the number is high, and maybe talking to sailors or people dealing with sailors in order to prevent them from getting the virus. But what's the scope of the problem?
Yeah, actually, certainly, with TR as being so visible and the USS Kidd, it would appear that actually the incidence or prevalence is much higher in the Navy than frankly it really is. And I will say that what we've learned from TR and Kidd, and I've mentioned it already, the importance of early recognition and isolation of those suspected of having the virus, the contact investigations, and when you look, frankly, as Admiral Thomas said, and perhaps can comment in more depth, Navy is out forward operating, and with rare exception has that changed, and so we will continue to refine our prevention. We will obviously, like any threat, we want to move to the left of bang. And we will continue to do that with what we learn about the virus, how to prevent the virus, and ultimately, as I said, hopefully to either provide therapeutics that prevent an individual from becoming infected, or ultimately an effective vaccine.
Did I hear you say a number, or did I miss the number? Can you address the number, or is that something you're not?
Really, I don't think the number is important. I think what's most important is to understand that it's a very small number relative to the entire size of the Navy and the Marine Corps, and we'll continue to work to keep it that way.
Got it. All right, thank you. Question from Joe Decker here online, and it talks about the guidance from different parts of the Navy on resuming work by phases. And as a citizen here in Washington, I'm watching the mayor and the governors of Virginia and Maryland go through the phases. Admiral Thomas, can you touch on what the policy is for the Navy about going back to work, resuming work? And Joe's question here is that being delegated to local commands? And can you shed any light on timelines at this point, or quite frankly, is it too early?
It's not too early. The stuff's sitting on my desk, and I was glad to leave it sitting there when I came over here. Actually, we're waiting on an OSD memo that I believe is going to come out here in the next 48 hours. And in the process, the way we do it in the Navy is we try to anticipate. We get a chance to chop on those policies, and then we craft what we call a nav admin, which is Navy guidance. And so I've been working with the fleets and with the other DCNOs to craft how the Navy's going to lower HPCon, and it's probably going to be a very measured approach. We're going to let the Navy component commanders control the level of HPCon within their AORs and their areas of responsibility, and we're going to do it locally, just like the states are doing. And we're going to look at there's been a database that's been created, lots of databases that have been created for authoritative data to be able to understand what the trends are of case numbers and symptoms. We're going to look at bed capacity and hospital capacity and put testing in place for our hospital care folks that are most at risk. We've got several measures in place as we start to bring services back on board. The Commander of Naval Installations Command and our region commanders that are outside the CONUS area have established procedures on what type of mitigation measures need to be put in place before you can open up places like gyms or barber shops, and all those things are being thought out and being planned for. And then it's going to be the local commanders that look at and assess the situation in their area and decide, based on guidance that we've established, are they ready to either lower the HPCon level or health protection condition level, or to bring back services. And we'll do it in a very phased and measured approach, conservative approach. We can't, it'll probably be more conservative than America, and for good reasons, because we have to maintain the health of our force for a lot of reasons, and we need to be able to put people back on ships and be able to go back to sea. And there'll probably be a little bit different rules for people that are on ships versus people that are, maybe on our shore staff. So we're trying to maintain consistency at the highest level, but allow local commanders to judge the situation on the ground where they are.
Thanks. And along the same lines, we have a question here online about future port visits, and you mentioned Ike the great aircraft carrier Ike earlier. They're unable to go to port. How does that continue to get updated? And the way the questions worded here is hopefully port visits are not being canceled completely. So what is the situation now, and how do you see that being changed in the future?
Certainly not being canceled completely. They're probably temporarily suspended is the way I would talk about it. And I think, again, just we'll look at the conditions. Certainly the entire world has been affected by this, and some countries have more transparent reporting than others, and we understand the situation in certain countries better than we do in others. Again, those naval component commanders, those fleet commanders that are operating forward will make that decision when they think it's safe to be able to pull a ship into port. We may start with some pure restricted liberty and try to create a bubble around the crew, even let them get ashore and enjoy some of the services that our morale, welfare, and recreation teams are so good at bringing towards the ships. I did an awful lot of sandbox liberty in the Gulf in my day, but we can still, it's better sometimes to be able to pull in port and drink a cold one and get on the internet that maybe is a little bit faster than our internet at sea. So we'll figure out how to phase it back and be able to bring some services and enjoyment back to the crew. It's going to be a little tough right here at the current time frame, but I guarantee it's in the mindset of every fleet commander. And I know we've taken some ships and been able to take them to some remote locations and get them a little bit of time off. But I'm not going to talk about where we're taking them and what we're doing. But in general, we'll get back to normal. It's just going to take us a little bit of time.
Thanks. And on the note of people and Admiral Gillingham, I think come to you on this. Mental health has been so important over the last 20 years. Post 9/11, and a question from James Kerr: what is the Navy doing to address mental health concerns of our service members during this COVID crisis?
That's a great question. One of the things that we've recognized is the value of having those mental health assets embedded with the fleet, and we learned that early on during combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so we've built on that. Right now, 30% of all of our mental health professionals in the Navy are what we call embedded, i.e. they're not in the medical treatment facility. They're actually out with the units themselves. And we've seen tremendous benefit from that. We also know that our medical providers, particularly those that were in New York and in other sites with very high COVID prevalence and severe disease, that they faced situations that they hadn't seen previously. And so we have a wonderful asset called a sprint team. That's a rapid ability to send forward psychiatric and mental health professionals. And so we've used those teams in areas of greatest need. But we continue to emphasize, the continuum of mental health, and that starts with individual resilience and making sure that we're giving sailors and our own providers all the tools they need to deal with that, and then supporting them, be it with our licensed clinical social workers, our psychologists, our psychiatrists, the deployed fleet resilience folks, our chaplains, of course, are always there. So we're very sensitive to that. This is, as Admiral Thomas said, very uncertain times. And so we're double down in terms of making sure we're forward projecting as much mental health support as we can. We're also leveraging telehealth and telemental health to the greatest extent that we can. That's been, I think that this episode, if you will, has accelerated our use of telemental health. So I think that will be an enduring capability, one that we will continue to build after this is over.
Thanks. And I will go ahead. Staying with that a little bit, the effort to share information to the public is a question we've gotten on the screen here. And the vast amount of information about the spread of the virus that the Navy has, how are you sharing that information and lessons learned with other federal entities, the CDC, et cetera? How is that linkage working?
It's actually been phenomenal. As I said, fortunately, one of my predecessors had the foresight to have a DoD liaison at the CDC. We have a regular dialogue with them. We are actively sharing information that we've learned with the CDC. And in fact, they participated as partners with us to do an outbreak investigation aboard TR. And they're currently in Atlanta reviewing, along with our Navy Marine Corps Public Health Center experts, they're reviewing that data now. The intent is to share that with the White House Task Force because we recognize that what we've learned, we can contribute that, if you will, force health protection to the American public.
And I think we have time for a couple more questions here. Admiral Sawyer, let me come back to you and talk. You've talked a lot about scheduling and deployments. 2 carriers out there deployed, 6 at sea. I have to believe that the fleet is wondering, how does this change the deployment requirements? How is that being managed from the fleet level going forward? And how do you see the overall presence changing or the deployment cycle changing? And then I'm going to come over to Admiral Gillingham on that same thing and ask, you mentioned earlier about managing the COVID-19 at sea, and how do you see that affecting ships at sea and the scheduling and the contingencies that you all need to prepare? So let me come over to Admiral Thomas first.
I would say I'm not going to talk too much about details here, but I would say that it's certainly in our vision of how is this going to impact us for the long term. What type of things do we need to put in place to be able to endure? I think we all believe this is going to be around for a while. Whether this first wave subsides and we get a second wave, how do we recognize that? How do we put things in place that will let us understand? How do we get our sailors and our workup cycles, our restriction of movement codified and get those best practice and put in place so we know we can confidently sail when needed, as needed. I think that the global presence, that's something that will stay fairly steady. We could see some impact, but certainly we're going to do what we can to maintain the presence that we need around the world. And so we'll learn. We'll get more efficient with being able to operate in this environment. The one thing that's great about the Navy is we are an adjustable, dynamic force. We can sail to where we need to be. We can adapt like we did with the Harry S. Truman and bring them back and keep them in a surge capacity so that they're ready. If we have a hiccup, they're the ready team, ready to sail wherever we need to. We'll get the Ronald Reagan out here very shortly and the Nimitz, and then we'll be able to bring those great Patriots back to shore. But our model and the way that we prepare our ships and sustain them is flexible. And this pandemic has caused us to have to exercise that flexibility. And I think that your Navy, if you had asked me how many, we get 6 carriers out to sea just a month and a half ago, I might have scratched my head. I'll give you a quick, you asked about the numbers earlier. I was thinking while you were talking to Bruce about numbers, how am I going to answer this question? But I'll give you a little anecdote here. The Nimitz Strike Group, I am just thoroughly impressed with the sailors and the leadership on that strike group. We took a little pool in my office as the crew and as the Air Wing was doing their restriction of movement operations on how many people were going to test positive, because we knew they were going to test the entire ship and Air Wing team. And that's about 3,000 sailors on the ship and 1,800 sailors in the Air Wing and another 1,500 on the cruisers and the destroyers. That's 7,000 people. And so we took a little wager, and no money, of course, but we just took a little friendly bet in the office on how many positive tests we were going to get out of that. And we all did the Price is Right thing and tried to undercut the other person. There was in the teens of number of people positive out of 7,000 people, and that just shows you how well the sailors followed the guidance, and then were able to bring it together on a ship, on multiple ships, and come together and get out to sea and really using public health mitigation measures and smart interactions beat this thing. And so we can do it, and we're going to continue to do it. And I think as we continue to learn and evolve, we'll find that the Navy's going to continue to operate, be forward, and be where it matters most.
Thanks. And I guess one final question, and I'll go to either one of you for this, and you pick. I think a question on everybody's mind is, how's the CNO doing? How, he's self-quarantined. How's he doing, and what can you tell us how he's doing?
I'll take that one.
He's doing fine. He first off, I'm impressed. He's following the guidance. Had close contact, and he's doing exactly what he expects his sailors to do. He's a senior top dog, and he's following the rules. And I can tell you, he's not working. He's got one of the things that Bruce talked about, telemedicine. Learned a lot there. Well, we've learned a whole lot about telework too. And he's sitting over in Tingy House doing just fine, running the Navy through secure VTCs and staying very much in touch with what's going on. So I can report CNO is doing just fine.
Thank you. So that's unfortunately all the time we have. I'd like to come to each one of you and ask if you have any closing comments you'd like to make. Admiral Gillingham, I'll come to you first, and then wrap up with Admiral Thomas.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks again for this opportunity. I hope from my remarks your audience understands Navy medicine is all in. This is our job, and we're taking great pride in supporting the fleet and the Marine Corps. We will continue to do that. We will continue to strive to stay right on the cutting edge of the science and apply that, to the health of our force.
And I would add,
These are trying times. These are trying times, not just for the United States, but for all of our allies and partners. I can tell you that we're sharing lessons. We're sailing with our closest allies and partners. We're present where it matters, and we'll continue to do so. And first and foremost, on our mind is the health and safety of our sailors. And we'll continue to evolve our policies and evolve our practices to ensure their health and well-being, and that your Navy can continue to sail forward.
Thanks. That wraps up the hour we have today. Thank you both, Admiral Thomas, Admiral Gillingham. Thank you for providing this SITREP. Thank you for your candor and your time. And I know you're busy. You mentioned the morale in the Pentagon. I cannot imagine what your work cycle is like. So I just have to say, on behalf of the 460 people that are on here right now, thank you for what you're doing for our Navy and for our nation and for the men and women who serve in our Navy today. And so on that note, I'd like to thank all of you out there who joined us today and for being what I consider naval enthusiasts. And for those of you who are serving or have served, or for that person who tried to get me to ask when plebe summer will begin, who will serve, as always, today I will tell you that we honor, recognize, and celebrate your service. Thank you very much.